New Year's Eve is supposed to feel hopeful. It is the night people pause, look back at the year behind them, and imagine something better ahead. For the Hassel family, it was meant to be exactly that, a quiet night. A family reunion, a rare moment of peace. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare that would destroy everything they thought they knew. On a cold New Year's Eve night, 41-year-old Tyrone Hassel Jr. was inside his home in a small, quiet Illinois neighborhood. There was no party, no loud music, no celebration spilling into the street. Just a family spending time together. His son, Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III, was home on military leave. After months of service, he was finally back with his family, staying at his father's house along with his wife and their 1-year-old child. It was supposed to be a short visit, a chance to breathe before returning to duty. The house felt normal, comfortable, safe. No one inside had any reason to believe they were only minutes away from tragedy. Shortly before 11 o'clock, Tyrone Jr. stepped outside. There was nothing unusual about it. He didn't grab a coat in a rush or show signs of fear. He simply walked out toward the driveway where his pickup truck was parked. Inside the house, life continued as usual. Then everything changed. The sound came suddenly, a sharp crack that didn't belong in a quiet neighborhood. Then another. Then another. For a brief moment, no one inside reacted. The human mind often refuses to accept danger immediately. Fireworks, maybe. Something else. Anything but gunshots. But deep down, they knew. Tyrone's daughter-in-law was the first to move. Panic took over as she rushed toward the door. Her heart was pounding before she even stepped outside, as if her body already knew what she was about to see. When she reached the driveway, the sight in front of her froze her in place. Tyrone Hassel Jr. was on the ground. He was lying near his pickup truck, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood covered his clothes and pooled on the concrete beneath him. His breathing was shallow, uneven, barely there. For a split second, time stopped. Then she screamed. Neighbors would later say they heard the sound and knew. Instantly, something was terribly wrong. A frantic call to emergency services followed. Her voice was shaking. Words came out broken, rushed, barely understandable. Police and paramedics were dispatched immediately. Within minutes, flashing lights filled the street. Officers rushed to secure the scene while paramedics ran toward Tyrone, dropping to their knees beside him. He had been shot multiple times. The wounds were severe, shots to the head, neck, and upper body. Blood loss was extensive. Yet somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. Paramedics worked quickly, doing everything they could to stabilize him. Every second mattered. Every movement was urgent. Nearby, Sergeant Hassel stood frozen, watching his father fight for his life. This was not a battlefield. This was his childhood home. The place that was supposed to be safe. Nothing about this made sense. Police officers began taping off the driveway. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering, staring, trying to understand what had just happened in their quiet community. The first assumption was simple. A robbery gone wrong. It was a theory that made people feel better. Random violence is easier to accept than intentional betrayal, but almost immediately that theory began to fall apart. Tyrone's wallet was still on him. His phone, his keys. Nothing had been taken. This wasn't a robbery. Officers examined the driveway closely. Spent shell casings were scattered across the ground. Bullet impacts told a disturbing story. The shooter had been close. Very close. This wasn't panic firing. This was controlled. Targeted. Personnel. As paramedics prepared Tyrone for transport, emotions at the scene escalated. His daughter-in-law attempted to follow him into the ambulance, visibly distressed. Officers had to hold her back as they balanced two critical responsibilities at once: saving a man's life and protecting a crime scene. Inside the house, officers conducted a quick search to ensure no one else had been harmed, especially the young child. The baby was found safe, unaware that his life had already been permanently changed. Outside, the driveway told a story no one was ready to hear yet. Bloodstains marked the ground. The angle of the shot suggested Tyrone had been standing near his truck when the attack began. Some rounds had even struck the garage, indicating the shooter's position behind him. Whoever did this knew exactly where Tyrone would be. They were waiting. As the ambulance doors closed and sirens faded into the distance, the neighborhood fell into a heavy silence, the kind that follows something irreversible. At that moment, investigators believed they were searching for an unknown, attacker somewhere out in the darkness. What they didn't know was that the truth was already standing beside them, and the most dangerous secret of all was still hidden inside the family. As the ambulance disappeared down the street, investigators were left standing in the Hassel family driveway with more questions than answers. The scene was chaotic but controlled. Officers moved deliberately, careful not to disturb evidence that might explain why a man had been shot in his own driveway on New Year's Eve. At first glance, it looked like a senseless act of violence, but the longer detectives studied the scene, the less that explanation made sense. Robbery was the first theory considered. It usually is. Random crime feels easier to process than intentional murder, but within minutes, that theory began to collapse. Tyrone Hassel Jr. still had everything on him. His wallet had not been touched. His phone was still in his pocket. His car keys were found nearby. There were no signs of a struggle that suggested someone had tried to take anything from him. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Detectives shifted their focus to the physical evidence. Spent shell casings lay scattered across the driveway. Their placement told an unsettling story. The shooter hadn't fired wildly. The shots were grouped, controlled, and purposeful. Bullet trajectories revealed that Tyrone had likely been standing near the driver's side of his truck when the attack began. Some rounds had traveled past him and struck the garage, showing the shooter's position with chilling clarity. This wasn't a drive-by. This was an ambush. Someone had been waiting. Inside the house, officers spoke with family members one by one. Everyone was shaken. Everyone claimed confusion. No one had seen anything. No one had heard voices before the shots. Tyrone's son, Sergeant Hassel, was devastated. He told police his father had no known enemies, no conflicts, no reason anyone would want him dead. Friends and neighbors later confirmed the same thing. Tyrone was known as a quiet man, a family man. He wasn't involved in crime. He wasn't mixed up in dangerous situations, which made the brutality of the attack even harder to understand. Detectives began reconstructing Tyrone's final hours. Where had he been? Who had he seen? What had he done before returning home? That timeline would become critical. Earlier that evening, Tyrone had left the house briefly. Surveillance footage later confirmed he had gone to a local Walmart. At first, this seemed insignificant. People run errands all the time. But then investigators learned what he had purchased. Ammunition, 9mm rounds, the same caliber used in the shooting. This discovery raised immediate questions. Why would Tyrone need ammunition on New Year's Eve? Was he expecting trouble? Was he afraid of someone? Or was this just an unfortunate coincidence? Detectives rushed to obtain Walmart's surveillance footage. Time mattered. If Tyrone had crossed paths with the wrong person, they needed to know. The footage showed Tyrone walking through the store calmly. No signs of fear. No argument. No confrontation. But at one point, he stopped and spoke with two other men in the aisle. The interaction was brief, casual, friendly even. Still, investigators couldn't ignore it. These were the last known people Tyrone had interacted with before he was shot. Police released images of the two men internally and began working to identify them. For a moment, it seemed like the investigation finally had traction. But once again, the case slipped out of reach. The two men were eventually identified as Tyrone's former high school friends. They had no criminal history tied to violence. No motive, no connection to the shooting. They were cleared completely. Another dead end. As hours turned into days, frustration began to build. This was no ordinary homicide. Every logical path investigators followed led nowhere. Then came the tips. As news spread through the community, people began calling in. Some claimed Tyrone had been involved in an argument days earlier. Others suggested mistaken identity. One caller said the shooter might have been targeting someone else entirely. Each tip was logged. Each was investigated. None held up. One theory suggested Tyrone may have been mistaken for his stepbrother, who had ongoing conflicts with other individuals. It was explored thoroughly. The stepbrother was interviewed. So were the people he had issues with. Once again, nothing. The physical differences alone made the theory unlikely. The stepbrother's appearance was distinct. Long dreadlocks, a completely different look from Tyrone. Mistaken identity didn't fit. What detectives didn't realize at the time was that they were looking too far outward. The truth wasn't hiding in the streets or in past arguments. It wasn't tied to random criminals or old grudges. It was much closer, so close that no one wanted to consider it yet. As investigators worked, Tyrone's father began doing something detectives hadn't asked him to do. He started searching on his own. Late at night, unable to sleep, he scrolled through social media. He reviewed posts, photos, comments, anything that might hint at who would want his son dead. That's when something caught his attention. Something that didn't feel right. A detail that made his stomach turn. He took it to police immediately. And with that single action, the investigation began to shift in a direction no one was prepared for. The investigation was slowly suffocating under its own weight. Detectives had chased dozens of tips, reviewed hours of footage, and spoken to anyone who had crossed paths with Tyrone Hassel Jr. in the days leading up to his death, and still they had nothing solid. No weapon, no suspect, no clear motive. Cases like this are dangerous, not just because a killer is still free, but because time works against the truth. Memories fade, details blur. Witnesses second-guess themselves. Then, just as frustration was peaking, one small detail surfaced, and it changed everything. Several days after the shooting, a resident who lived near the Hassel home contacted police. At first, they didn't think what they saw was important enough to report. But the more they thought about it, the more it bothered them. On the night of the shooting, they had noticed a vehicle parked in an unusual way. It was a black four-door car, backed into the driveway of a nearby house that was listed for sale. The house was empty. No one should have been there. The car's engine was off. The lights were off. It was positioned in a way that, suggested the driver, didn't want the license plate visible from the street. The witness remembered watching it for several minutes. Then, shortly after hearing gunshots, the car sped away. This detail immediately caught investigators' attention. Professional criminals don't park like that by accident. Backing into a driveway isn't random. It's a tactic, one designed for a fast escape. Detectives ran the description through every system available to them. License plate reader data from nearby roads, toll booths, traffic cameras. Eventually, they got a hit. The black four-door car had been captured passing through toll cameras shortly after the murder. The plates were clear. The owner's name stopped investigators cold. The vehicle belonged to an active-duty U.S. Army service member. Even more unsettling, that service member was assigned to the same military installation as Tyrone's son. And he wasn't just a distant acquaintance. He was close. His name was Jeremy. For the first time since the shooting, the case had a real direction. Investigators dug into Jeremy's background, his service record, his travel history, his relationships. They needed to know why his car had been near the crime, seen at exactly the wrong time. What they found raised even more questions. Jeremy was not from Illinois. He lived out of state. According to records, he had traveled a long distance shortly before the murder. Why would he be in that neighborhood on New Year's Eve? There was no official reason. No family connection. No legitimate explanation. As detectives looked closer, they uncovered something far more disturbing than coincidence. Jeremy had a personal relationship with someone inside the Hassel family. A relationship no one had been honest about. He wasn't just a fellow soldier. He wasn't just a friend. He was involved with Sergeant Hassel's wife. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Suddenly, details that once seemed meaningless began to take on a darker meaning. The behavior at the crime scene, the emotional reactions, the inconsistencies in statements, all of it looked different now. Detectives knew they had to move carefully. Accusations without proof could destroy lives. But they also knew that affairs, secrecy, and jealousy are powerful motives, and sometimes they lead to murder. Investigators reached out to military authorities immediately. Cases involving active-duty service members require coordination. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division was brought in. Interviews were scheduled. Records were requested. At the same time, detectives quietly began re-examining everything connected to Tyrone's daughter-in-law. Her phone records, her messages, her movements. The woman who had appeared so distraught that night was now at the center of the investigation. And what detectives were about to discover would reveal that Tyrone's murder wasn't just personal. It was planned, carefully, coldly, by someone who had stood beside the family and watched them grieve. The investigation had moved from the streets to the heart of the Hassel family's home life. Detectives had Jeremy on their radar, but what terrified them most wasn't just the distance he had traveled. It was the influence someone close to the family had over him. Tyrone Hassel III's wife, a young woman in her early 20s, had appeared vulnerable and scared in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. Everyone assumed she was a grieving widow, overwhelmed by the violence that had entered her home. But when investigators began to trace her communications, a darker picture emerged. Messages, social media posts, and phone records hinted at manipulation. Someone had been directing Jeremy's actions. Someone who had the motive, opportunity, and knowledge to orchestrate the attack from the inside. Detectives interviewed her carefully, maintaining a balance between tact and pressure. At first, she claimed confusion, fear, and grief. She insisted she had no knowledge of the plot, that she had no reason to suspect anyone could commit such an act. But small inconsistencies began to appear. Details about where she had been that night. Mentions of Jeremy's arrival. Even her demeanor, the way she described events, didn't match the timeline established by surveillance footage and eyewitness accounts. Investigators soon realized that this wasn't just a case of one person influencing another. This was premeditated, deliberate, coldly calculated. The more they dug, the more it became clear that the woman had not been a passive observer. She had planned, directed, and encouraged actions that would culminate in murder. Jeremy had traveled across state lines. He had arrived prepared. The shooting had been executed, according to a plan that only someone with intimate knowledge of the family's habits could have devised. Evidence showed financial motives as well. Life insurance policies, military benefits, and potential inheritance provided a tangible reason for the calculated attack. This was not just about anger or jealousy. There was a deliberate effort to benefit materially from a tragic act. The investigators now faced a delicate situation. Arresting or confronting her too early could compromise the case. They needed evidence that could stand in court. They needed confessions, corroborating testimony, digital proof. And slowly it started to come together. Interviewing Jeremy was another challenge. Unlike his co-conspirator, he exercised his right to remain silent. He refused to speak to authorities no matter the pressure. Every question met with a firm legal barrier. That left investigators with a single path, building the case around the woman who had orchestrated everything. Her actions, her messages, her planning. They told the story even if her lips would not. Day after day, detectives pieced together the timeline. The planning that took place weeks before the murder. The messages that instructed Jeremy exactly when and how to act. The financial records that revealed she stood to gain from Tyrone's death. Everything pointed to a single truth. Tyrone Hassel Jr. had been targeted. Not randomly, but by someone he trusted. Someone in the family circle. What had once looked like chaos. The panicked screams, the scattered shell casings, the frenzied calls to 911 was now revealed as the culmination of months of planning. The investigators faced the difficult task of presenting this narrative to the public without sensationalizing it. They had to be meticulous, precise, and patient. One slip, one misstatement, and the story could be undermined in court. But despite all caution, the human element was unavoidable. The family's grief, the community's shock, and the small moments of horror revealed a universal truth. Evil often hides where we least expect it. For the listeners following this story, the message is chilling. The danger was not outside the home. It was inside. And the deeper detectives looked, the clearer it became, justice would not be simple. It would require painstaking work, unwavering focus, and the courage to confront betrayal at the very core of a family. The investigation had exposed a truth more horrifying than anyone imagined. Tyrone Hassel Jr.'s murder had not been random. It had been meticulously planned and executed, with someone inside the family orchestrating every move. The evidence against the daughter-in-law was mounting. Her communications, her instructions to Jeremy, her own financial motives, it all pointed to premeditation. Investigators knew that confronting her too early could risk losing the chance for a full confession, so they carefully staged interviews to build psychological pressure. And then it happened. During a prolonged interrogation, she began to speak. Not out of remorse at first, but because she wanted to justify her actions. Every word she spoke revealed not only the sequence of events, but her mindset, calculating, cold, and deliberate. She had influenced Jeremy. She had directed him. She had ensured he followed through. It was a chilling account. The meticulous planning, the choice of date, the timing, the knowledge of the family's routine. Every detail underscored that this was not a crime of passion. It was an execution designed to achieve a goal. The motive became clearer. Tyrone Hassel Jr. had been providing for his family, but in her view, it wasn't enough. She believed she was overburdened, that her life was restricted, and that financial gain would solve her perceived problems. Life insurance policies confirmed her plan. She stood to receive a significant sum upon her husband's death. Her entitlement to military benefits only strengthened the motive. It was cold, transactional, and terrifying. Jeremy, for his part, would later plead guilty to second-degree murder, admitting he had followed through on the instructions given to him. But the daughter-in-law was at the heart of the operation. Without her manipulation, her orchestration, and her knowledge, none of it would have happened. Once the confession and corroborating evidence were collected, law enforcement moved in. Arrests were made. Charges were filed. The community that had been stunned into silence now faced the reality of betrayal at its most personal level. Court proceedings revealed the full scope of the plan. Friends and family were shocked to learn that the person they had trusted, the person who had been inside their home that fateful night, had orchestrated the murder. The testimony, evidence, and digital trail left no room for doubt. On August 29, 2019, the daughter-in-law was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would never see freedom again. Jeremy Hassel, the accomplice, was sentenced to 65 years in prison with his earliest eligibility for parole at age 90. Attempts to appeal or withdraw his plea were rejected by the courts, ensuring that justice would remain intact. For the Hassel family, the aftermath was a mixture of grief, relief, and lingering shock. Tyrone Hassel Jr. was gone, and nothing could bring him back. But the exposure of the truth prevented further injustice and ensured that those responsible would never harm anyone else. In the end, this case became more than just a story of murder. It was a story of deception, manipulation, and the extremes of human betrayal. It served as a warning that sometimes the most dangerous threats are not strangers, but those closest to us. The neighborhood returned to its quiet routine, but the scars remained. Family bonds were broken, trust was shattered, and yet law enforcement's meticulous work, the courage of witnesses, and Tyrone Hassel Jr.'s father's own persistence ensured that justice, though delayed, was achieved. For listeners and viewers, the story leaves one undeniable truth. Vigilance, awareness, and the relentless pursuit of facts can uncover even the most hidden evil, no matter how close it hides. Tyrone Hassel Jr.'s life was stolen, but the story of what happened ensures that his death is remembered, his family protected, and the crime never forgotten.